50-51.
Would the Patterson family please come forward? Whenever any of the women in the Patterson family, you better stay down there, we won't be able to see the slides, I think. Whenever any of the women in the Patterson family get married, they say, who will give this woman away? The whole family stands up, so that's their tradition, and they've asked to stand up. Toto. D.W.Patterson was born the second youngest of 7 children in Clarksville, Indiana in 1911, just 3 years before the outbreak of World War I. He died in 1958. In sport, in his studies, and as a businessman, he seemed always to work harder than those around him. Inadequately prepared because he came from a small rural high school, he worked as a soda jerk to put himself through 2 years of science at a Missouri War College. It prepared him for acceptance to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. An excellent basketball player, Pat boxed, played soccer, ran cross country at Annapolis, where he also won his letter in track and field. While at the Naval Academy, he got in trouble when it was discovered that he was studying in the bathroom after lights out. He confided to a friend, and I want all my students out there to pay close attention to this. He once held a lit match to his finger so that the pain would keep him awake so he could study for an important exam all night. 2 years after his 1935 graduation, he saw the light. He found a Canadian sweetheart, and they were married. He and Mary started to have a raft of kids. 5 daughters, Mary, Patricia, Virginia Lee, Noreen, Juanita, and Ruth, and 3 sons, Paul, Howard, and Whitmer. Upon graduation, Pat Patterson began to put the same sort of effort he'd made as a student. Same sort of effort he'd made as a student, not as a husband. Although the analogy goes to husband as well, I guess. Into his professional and volunteer life. He started work for Coca-Cola in the States, but was soon transferred to Toronto. In 1941, he jumped at the opportunity to acquire the Cape Breton Coca-Cola franchise. The Patterson family moved to Sydney. Jim Sense, isn't this great? Isn't it terrific that Pepsi-Cola isn't our sponsor? I know, I'm not even supposed to mention that word. In addition to parties, wartime Sydney leisure activities included movies, dances, bingo, and sport. The Vogue Theatre had opened only 2 years before, showing Gone with the Wind as its very first film. He was the first to bring American-style basketball to Nova Scotia. For 12 years, through the efforts of Pat Patterson, his name, the name of Cape Breton Beverages, and championship basketball became joined. Pat, as he became known quickly, got heavily involved in the community. He joined the Sydney Rotary Club, was their first president. He was an active member of the First United Church, a leader in the YMCA and in Lions. He sold war bonds. In no instance was there a fuss made about his efforts. It all took place very quietly. He became president of the Colby Home and School Association, was known as the only father to attend school events when parents were invited. His own children he made special when he supplied all their schoolmates with Coca-Cola wooden rulers. It seemed he was active in every youth organization in the city. His nomination tonight is for none of these things, though they're all appreciated. Tonight he's being inducted because of his involvement in basketball, particularly his volunteer coaching of both boys and girls at Sydney Academy. He was approached in January 1944 and asked if he wouldn't coach the juvenile team at the Y. He responded that he wouldn't do that, but if they could work out an arrangement between the high school and the Y gym and get the gymnasium, he would venture to coach the high school team. It's true that Sydney Academy had a sport history before Pat's arrival. They could trace their first hockey games on the Bay back to 1905, and their first maritime basketball championship back to 1927. Long before they got their first gym in 1958, which, by the way, was after Pat had finished his tenure as basketball coach. They practiced and played their games in that YMCA gym. The Academy's dominance in boys basketball really began under Coach Pat Patterson and continued throughout his stay, which was from 44 to 56. They won their first provincial title in their first year together when they beat Queen Elizabeth High School, and their first maritime championship when they beat Rothsay, New Brunswick in that same year, 1944. In both instances, they were up against boys who had superior athletic and basketball skills, but who played for teams that weren't coached by Pat Patterson. After beating Newcastle, New Brunswick in 1945, the team was met at the city limits by a motorcade which included a fire truck full of kids. Typical away games at this time demanded, for example, when they played local rivals Glace Bay, that the teams rent a tram car to take them to the game Friday afternoon and then home again after the dance, which inevitably followed the game. Patterson boys teams went on to win 12 consecutive Cape Breton titles. They were undefeated in Eastern Nova Scotian A competition. They won 10 provincial titles and 7 straight maritime championships. While opponents usually took a licking when they played the academy, the sting was always taken out of the loss because Coach Patterson ensured that players from both sides always got a bottle of Coke after the game. During this World War II era of gas rationing, his car was communal property as far as the team was concerned. Pat somehow managed to take his teams on trips. The kids visited New Brunswick, as well as places in Nova Scotia as far away as Digby. Moose Mercer recalls that when Pat said, "Hell's fire," all heads turned. It was an expression he used often when emoting to the boys, and it was the strongest language he ever used. He never allowed his players to get cocky. He played the Canadian champion New Waterford Strands every year, despite the fact that his boys could never beat the senior team. Pat felt that they always learned, and it kept his players' egos in perspective. As one of his players put it, he asked no quarter and yet was compassionate to those in trouble. If Pat Patterson were here, he'd happily agree with Canadian coach Jack Donahue, who once told us that when coaches are met at the Golden Gates, they're not asked how many championships did you win. They're asked how many men and women did you make out of how many boys and girls. Boys and girls that Pat Patterson pushed into productive lives can't be counted. Many of his players went on to university. There's no question that at the Golden Gates, Pat Patterson passed this test with flying colors. One of his players, Jack Stewie, had a fiery temper. Pat pulled him aside and said, "Hell's fire, Jack. I need you in the game, not on the bench. Control yourself." That was the way he disciplined. Pat coached the varsity boys and girls teams. If he'd had his way, he would have coached several teams at all levels so that no kid would have to be cut and all would have the opportunity to play. His teams were like family. Much to the delight of his own children, he'd have the players out every summer to the family cottage in Benyon, and every player could count on being invited to the Pattersons at least once for supper during the season. He cared for them as people, a fact which was made evident by his keeping in touch with the players long after they ceased to be players. Johnny Bill Rutherford was a grubby little kid who lived behind the Cape Breton beverage building when he first met Pat Patterson. He remembers well how the former boss of the company used to chase all the kids away. Pat used a different approach. He put them to work, sweeping the floor and doing other useful chores around the plant. When Johnny Bill got old enough to do a man's work, he worked part-time and in the summers driving a truck and lugging cases. He once proposed to Pat that he quit school and come on as a full-time employee. Pat told him that the job was his as long as he stayed to finish school. The day he quit high school, Pat said, is the day the job ceases. He struck the same deal with several of his players, one of whom grew up to be Father George Kehoe. Pat was once talked into going to Halifax as coach with a team made up of his former players. On the way home, they got snowed in for 2 days in New Glasgow. He picked up the tab for the motel for all of them. He had a little black book in which he kept tabs on little loans he made to players who needed money for sneakers or food while they were on trips. The players always paid him back or worked it off. Would that every town in Nova Scotia would have a Pat Patterson. In 1958, St. Agnes Central, Mount Carmel, New Waterford, and host Sydney Academy played in the first Pat Patterson basketball tournament. It was a fitting memoriam to the man who gave so much to basketball, to Sydney, to Nova Scotia, and especially to all those kids who became happy, productive adults because of his love and guidance. Ladies and gentlemen, our first individual to be inducted tonight, a man who didn't like the way reporters singled out the high scorers for special coverage, and so refused to let writers talk to his players. He wrote up the games himself, stressing defense and equality of credit. He'd hand the story to the reporters. How do you like that, Joel Jacobson? A man who was absolutely revered by those who played for him because, as one of his players so succinctly put it, he didn't teach basketball, he taught a way of life. A great coach, a great teacher, a great person, Mr. D.W.Patterson.
Oh, don't go. Come on back, folks. Ladies and gentlemen, we have here obviously a very, very proud Patterson family who have come to join us tonight from all over Canada and the United States. And I want to ask them to join us on stage right now, if you would, please. Come on up.
What an ugly family.
And I would ask Ken McDonald, the chairman of the selection committee for Cape Breton, if he would come forward, please, to make the presentations. Howard? I want to ask each member of the family to identify themselves, tell us where they're coming from, and then we'll have a word from Howard.
I'm Mary Patricia Warnicki, number 1, and I traveled from Indianapolis, Indiana.
I'm Joanne Ruth Patterson. I'm number 8, and I came from Fairfax, Virginia.
My name is Juanita Irene Patterson Gutierrez, and I come from Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
I'm Virginia Lee Patterson Heusler, and I'm living in Scottsdale, Arizona.
I'm Howard Patterson, and I came in from Evansville, Indiana.
I'm Whit Patterson from Santa Rosa, California.
Normal Paul Patterson from Sydney, Cape Breton again.
He came back! He came back, folks! Who was the family spokesman, Howard?
Well, this is a surprise because we were all trying to decide who was going to say something, and we never did until just now. And we didn't have a captain of the team, so I guess we all were the equal teammates. I think the only thing I can say that if my father was here, he would probably give this all to 2 people. One would be as a coach to his players, and say that a coach is only as good as his players, and that it starts with those young men. And I think that's evidenced by the way they're here tonight, sharing those stories with me who never remembered my father. And in fact, they would come and share those stories this evening. And I think the other would be, there's never a good coach who has a good family without a coach's wife. And that would be our mother. And hearing the boys and this really comes from the players and talking to them earlier, how they were telling stories about my father and then turning right around and saying how they could walk into the house and how my mother would treat them. And so without saying anything more, I think those are the 2 people or 2 groups that he would dedicate this to, being rather than taking it upon himself, it'd be the players and the coach's wife.
Okay, folks, if you'll just stay right there for a moment. We have 9 members of those Pat Patterson teams who are here tonight, who have traveled from all over to be with us for this great occasion. And I know that the Pat family would like to share it with these players. So I'd ask them please to come forward. Jack Stewie. Jack Stewie, where are you? Gordy McNeil. Harry Henderson. Gordy McCoy. Gordon Moose Mercer. J.B. Rutherford, Johnny Bill. Leonard Morrison, Mooney. Jack Bone. And Dr. Alvaro McKean. Okay, I'm sure just the way Pat would have loved to see it tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Pat Patterson, his family and his players.